Right? Sometimes we write as P, R, N, G. So pseudo-random number generation in this very informal level is to try to stretch a perfect random seed to a longer random looking seed. So that's the schematic picture of pseudo-random number generation. In other words, imagine that we have pseudo-random seed of length n, which means that all string here will be chosen uniformly at random. So then we would like to map them into a bigger random seed. And so naturally this will no longer be random in the sort of uniform randomness sense, because it's impossible. Because in this particular map, we cannot use any additional randomness anymore. So which means the only randomness showed up in the initial sequence, and which means that this map is just a deterministic map. Which means it's sort of inject into this much longer string. And but we want the longer string to be so-called pseudo-random in the sense that with all purpose of computation, particularly in the language of polynomial time, we want to argue this string or this distribution of string behave almost exactly as if you draw from a uniform source. So there's a purely uniform source out here, right? So this distribution produced by pseudo-random generation, we would like them to so-called computationally similar to as if you draw from this longer source. And last time I mentioned this actually is a universal protocol together with exclusive OR encoding or one-time encoding to give a general solution to the so-called symmetric key encryption scheme. Right? So what the schema just simply becomes following. We still have our key space to be 0, 1 to the n. And our key agreement is still just the same uniform distribution, just like Shannon's theorem said. Right? The key generation is uniform on K. Right? So we still draw a random sequence in the original domain, and then we give it to sender and we give it to receiver in this symmetric scheme. But we would like to talk longer. So that's the main thing we want to talk longer. If we only need to talk at the length of n, then we should do nothing. We just do the old runtime path, right? Because every bit we encode is just as good as we proved before. But suppose our communication is longer, hopefully polynomially longer than this particular agreed seed. That one of the intuitive way, which actually is a universal way, one can show, to achieve this is simply to first design a good pseudo-random number generator, which I will define what is good, mostly into this lecture. And then we just simply apply that into this universal schema of one-time path. Right? That is, we have this pseudo-random number generator. So this is intuitive stretch n bits to, let's say, L bits. Suppose L is decided to be the length that you think the most talkative person cannot talk longer than that anymore. So that's the upper limit you want to talk. So then one way to implement such a schema is, again, you use the generation to generate the key, and when you need to encrypt the encryption scheme, you just simply take a message and then you just simply take your random key. So you have this random key, you apply to, so let me write. Sorry guys. Yeah. So we produce a set of the key they agreed upon, we stretch it out into a longer key, but we construct this just locally here. So this is locally computable, right? Since this protocol is public too. And then to encrypt, we just simply define CI equal to MI exclusive OR with KI. So this will just be the encryption, right? So for decryption, we do the same thing. That is, we want to recover MI is equal to CI. The reason we can conduct this encryption and decryption is following. That if you look at this particular protocol, right? So one thing we learn about a secure communication protocol is that first we need to know what is public, what is private, right? The only thing private is K. The only thing private is K. Everything else is public, including generation distribution, which we know is just uniform, and including this algorithm called PRNG, that is making sequence longer, and which means this PRNG is known to here, and is known to here. It's actually is known to here too, right? The attacker knows this thing too, right? But with the secret K, the sender can compute a longer sequence because it knows the pseudo-random number generator, and the receiver can also do it because it also knows the pseudo-random number generator. And because we knew this is a deterministic algorithm, there's no more randomness in it, which means clearly both of them are running the same algorithm. Which means that when they apply to K, they will receive the same stretched key, right? So therefore, they are able to encode and decode on both ends, right? So this clearly schematically is only a small change from our old one-time path, but this actually is quite a universal schema. If we can conduct something called pseudo-random number generator, right? So from our perspective of the study for a while, the analysis of a crypto system, this in many ways you should think as a reduction. So this literally is a reduction from secure communication to pseudo-random number generator. Right. So this is a phenomena that will reduce one fundamental problem to another fundamental problem. Right. So this basically says if you can generate pseudo-random numbers, match eventually the standard of which we have defined, then the secure communication can be accomplished at proper security level. Okay. So this, to a large degree, is a universal schema for the classical secure communication. Okay. So you can see this is part of the reason why pseudo-random number generation is a fundamental primitive. Okay. So today, initially I was planning actually to give more concrete protocols and some of the analysis for pseudo-random number generation. Eventually I decided to actually switch my sequence of class just a little bit to accommodate that because that protocol I need to talk more, and what I can right now I cannot quite do coughing-wise is I can't talk more. So I will go with the second subject of what is the pseudo-randomness. So I will go over there because I only need to prove one lemma today for the whole class. I think probably I have enough voice just to do that. Okay. So what is pseudo-randomness? really, this is a very basic question, but this is really awesome. First time we got 4 classes back, people are not sick anymore, then I'm sick. So I have been sustained pretty long, at least up to this moment. I took my flu shot last week. I guess just you have to take a flu shot a little bit earlier to be effective, right? They said it typically takes 2 weeks to settle, with probability 60% to prevent a cold flu, right? That's what they said. Right? So what is pseudo-randomness? So what is pseudo-randomness? So for finite string, so let me just first say one thing we know. For finite strings, so finite strings, we know what is randomness. Right, that's one thing we know. What is totally uniform distribution? We know what is uniform distribution. Right? So imagine that our target is L bits. Imagine our target is L bits. Right? Imagine our target is L bits. We know for sure, and we know not just intuitively, we know mathematically, what is a uniform string from L bits. Right? What is uniform string from L bits? Is every string of length L showed up with probability 1/2 to the L. Right? So this means for all k L minus 1, L0 from here, the probability of KL minus 1, K0 is chosen is equal to 1. Right. So this is one thing we know for sure. This is called uniform, right? A uniform L-bit string is precisely defined to be that every sequence of L bits should up with the equal probability, right? So our question here, at least with respect to finite sequence, is what is a pseudo-random L-bit string, L-bit distribution? Right. So what is a pseudo-random L-bit distribution? Right. So which means you have, so let's call this distribution. So let's call this distribution called PU of L. So let me just use PU and L. Right. PUL, let me use it to define uniform string of length L. Right. Which means that the probability each of the strings chosen is 1/2 to the L. Right. So pseudo-randomness, which means we have another distribution. We have some other distribution. So let's call that distribution P. So let me call it PL PU tilde L. So let me use this as my shorthand notation, which means that I'm not perfect right now, right? So this basically means that if we really think about it, it will assign each of the sequence with another probability, right? It's still a probabilistic distribution over all the L-bit string, right? So which means this means that for some of the string, the k is chosen may not be equal to 2 to the L, right? May not be equal to 2 to the L. So in old world of statistics, when we say this is approximately that, there's many different measurements people can give. One of the measurements is to say, okay, that everybody is not 1/2 to the L, maybe it's 1/2 to the L plus minus some noise, right? Or it may be that if you look at like so-called total variation of this and this, if you look at all the point-wise difference of probability, if you add it up, it's not too big. So that's usually is a statistical definition, right? But if you look at from the pseudo-random number generation perspective, what's going on is that, in fact, we knew very often that if we deal with pseudo-random number generation, some of the k actually has 0 probability. Right. So as I mentioned here, because this map is deterministic, against every pseudo-random number generations, some string may not be picked up. Right? So which means that in our pseudo-random number generation, from low bits to high bits, inevitably, some of the string will have 0 probability. So this actually makes the sort of additive noise definition challenging, right? You know, you can't just simply say everyone is a little bit worse than 1 over 2 to the L. Because someone has 0. You know, this is inevitably the case. Right? So this actually has been bothering the statistician or probabilist for a very long time to figure out how to define this pseudo-randomness. Right? Because you can't just simply say every string has similar probability. Right? So that clearly is out. And this is where computationally one actually has a much easier task. So if you look at it from computational perspective, then one actually have a little bit easier task. The task is basically, I'm there to look at every density to see how much gap we have. That's really is not the computational perspective. Or you can treat it as a learning perspective. What really happens is that if you look at random sequence or a uniform sequence, one of the ways which we keep on saying is universal test is some kind of a Turing test. Right? Namely, you have these two sources of random distribution, PUL and PU tilde L. Right? Suppose I'm doing a design Turing test. So how do I design Turing test? Almost this is like a wine testing again, right? Which means that I will choose some sequence from this distribution. I will choose a sequence from this distribution. I don't tell you where. Can you tell apart? Right? This is our universal test, right? Essentially, whatever algorithm you want to design yourself, what you're facing is that I give you a sequence, you need to predict whether this sequence was drawn likely from this distribution or from this distribution, right? And in many ways, from computational learning perspective, I technically allow you to draw many samples. Then can you tell them apart, right? So for example, in today, if you look at some branch of machine learning, they often have a domain called learning distributions, which means that, in practice, your data may come from some distribution, and you draw a sample there, you want to see whether you can somehow capture that distribution, right? For example, when we often see social networks, and people want to learn like the local connectivity of social network, right? Namely, we go to a random person, we expand 2 levels to see who are friends with whom, right? And then clearly, from a practical graph, it defines some distribution. It's not clearly mathematical defined, but that distribution is defined once I give you a large social network, right? And from learning perspective, in many ways, you want to draw these samples. Eventually, you want to come up with a compact enough model to interpret this, right? So in all those basically means that what you see is only sample, and then you are able to somehow build up features of the distribution you face, right? So clearly, the feature of a uniform distribution is the one that even though I tell you, and when you see samples, in some sense, all you can do is to eventually build up this sort of product distribution, each bit showed up with probability half. Okay, but in general, when we are facing 2 distributions, so one of the fundamental tasks mathematically, or from learning perspective, or statistical perspective, or probability perspective, is that can you distinguish this distribution from this distribution. Right? So this is basically like you build a model for social network, and then if I ask you to generate a local neighborhood of social network, then I began to draw a social neighborhood on Facebook. Then if I'm able to tell the difference, then intuitively I will say your generator is not good enough. Right? Somehow you didn't capture the other distribution, if I can tell apart. Okay? So the question is, can we distinguish this distribution? And this really become so-called the computational measurements. That is, can we distinguish distribution when you have only polynomial time capacity? So this is called polynomial time distinction. Polynomial time distinguishability, whether you can distinguish two distributions in polynomial time. Okay. So how do we capture this? One simple way to capture this is that you will write some algorithm, highly powerful statistical analysis algorithm, right? And whenever you see a string k, you will attempt to output 1 if you believe somehow this is drawn from the first distribution, which means uniform. And otherwise, you would like to attempt to draw, say, is 0. Right? So you yourself try to somehow analyze this sequence, and eventually you will say, this is highly likely this will draw from uniform distribution, or is highly likely draw from slightly flawed distribution. Right? So for example, your algorithm could be just counting how many 0 and 1s. Right? And intuitively, if you always see 1s, you will see this most likely not come from uniform distribution. Right? So then you can output 0. Right? But it doesn't mean that in uniform distribution you don't have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Right? So we try to have algorithm somehow to capture the statistical essence of the distribution. Right? So suppose you have an algorithm that take a string of L bits and just output 0 and 1. And each such algorithm can be used as a potential distinguishers against distribution. Right? So how do you do this? You will feed from uniform, or you will feed from this, then you will look for a difference. Right? So we can measure its so-called expected behavior. Okay? We can measure its expected behavior. So what is expected behavior of a Boolean function that goes from L bits to 1 bits? So we can measure in expectation whether it's go 0 or 1. Okay? In expectation is go 0 and 1. Right? So if we want to write this way, I can write out the expected value of algorithm to be, for example, the probability that probability k is chosen, then times the probability that ak. So this is for all k's belong to. Right. And this probability we can use either, for example, the uniform one or the the potentially pseudo-random one. Okay. So let me use this as my little indicator P. Right. So this is one of the expected behavior of algorithm against a set of random string. Right. So let me just give you an example. Once you think computationally, so what other algorithm may be, right? So one of algorithm of A can be the following. So I'm just giving you an example how to design A. So one is basically you just try to compute the number of 1s and 0s you can say if the number of ones and zeros, the difference is outside square root of n, you just output 0, because that is not uniform random enough, right? So that's one possibility, right? And I'm sure you can define pseudo-randomness for this thing. You just put all your strings in that distribution, and you can make it non-uniform as possible. It will just always output correctly. Okay. So the other way, for example, you can attempt to think about is that imagine that you write a quicksort, right? And then we do a mathematical analysis to say quicksort will end in expectation of remember n times the harmonic number of n, number of comparisons, if you run quicksort with uniform seed. So then you can use that as your benchmark to say I draw a random number to guide my quicksort from a distribution. If I'm robustly hitting that range, I will say uniform. Otherwise, I will say not uniform. Right? So you can see this from computational perspective, you can define many, many different types of distinguishers. For example, the other distinguisher could be you run the polynomial time algorithm, randomized algorithm for testing primes. Right? Because we used to say that if a number is not a prime, with probability at least half, you will see a weightiness. Right? Because if you draw a certain sequence, you don't see that much weightiness anymore, then you will conclude that source is not random enough. Right? So computational will allow you to essentially use whatever creativity you have to attempt to build a distinguisher from two distributions. Okay? So let me define the following. I say algorithm A is an epsilon distinguisher of, in this particular case, PUL and PU tilde L, if EA running on PUL minus, so this I call P, I think I'm right now. So if I'm able to design an algorithm whose expected performance against first distribution and second distribution is more than epsilon, I will call this algorithm an epsilon distinguisher. Right? An epsilon distinguisher is the one that if I run it on the first uniform seed, I look at the behavior, and I minus my behavior on the other pseudo-random seeds. If I can open a gap of epsilon, I call it the epsilon distinguisher. Okay, this is with respect to a particular algorithm. Okay, and clearly here, from computational perspective, I can limit it, for example, the running time of it. Okay. So with this notion, I can define this notion called polynomial time indistinguishability. Right. So let me write down another formal definition. That I will say PUL and PU tilde L is polynomial time indistinguishable if it does not exist a polynomial time machine. Algorithm such that A is at epsilon such that for all epsilon that is 1 over poly of L. So for all polynomial fraction, 1 over polynomial of L is our base. If for all epsilon as a polynomial fraction, if I can't have an algorithm that can achieve 1 over polynomial gap between the behavior of UL and U tilde L, then I will call the UL is polynomial time indistinguishable from the uniform distribution. Okay. So this is totally a universal computational view of this, right? So here I didn't tell you how to design A, because once I say there's no such thing exists, it's in your course to design A, right? So this is where complexity theory offers certain language to define the level of security, right? Because we need to define that there exists such attack. So which means that you can be creative to create your attack. But on the other hand, if I say, doesn't matter what you do, you can't design a polynomial time machine to create a 1 over polynomial gap between these two sources, then I will say this two sources is computationally indistinguishable. This means for any polynomial time machine, when you run it, its behavior of the pseudo-random source against random source is approximately the same. Right? Because if it's not the same, that is distinguisher. So that's why that distinguisher could be this clever statistical way to counting bits, or could be its performance of an algorithm which uses randomness. Right? So you can see this can go very far-fetching on what you can design. So this becomes sort of the computational benchmark of pseudo-randomness with respect to polynomial time. So clearly, if you want to change polynomial time into some higher order time, then you just need to change whatever gap and compute the complexity you match just like before. We can talk about even higher degree of security. Right. So any question up to here? This, I think that's why from computer science background, this look essentially very natural definition today when we look. When you take years for people to come up with a simple definition as this, right? And you take another few years to realize there's even simpler definitions. That will be the task of today. Because this is still relatively hard to analyze using this definition. So all this said is that if there's no polynomial time machine can tell the difference between two distributions, then that is pseudo-random. So that is the computational definition. Right? It gives the gap and also gives the running time. So this basically just like when we talk about the public key security. We said there's no polynomial time algorithm when you receive the public key can break the encryption up to a certain gap. Okay. Any question up to here? So this so far is purely definitional, and as you can see that when the pioneers of the field facing, for example, formulation like this, ultimately when they need to build pseudo-random number generators, they have to find some way to prove that their pseudo-random number generators are polynomial time indistinguishable from the uniform source, maybe upon certain computational assumption, right? So how can they conduct such a task? And this is one of the next lemma, which is the main technical theorem which I would like to discuss, which provide a very clean bridge of how one might analyze this phenomenon. Okay, so so NDR noticed the following analysis. What he called is the next bit predictor. He said, if you go to statistical world, there's another way people analyze randomness. And we can also put the computational pictures in it. That is the following. So imagine you have random string, the 0, V1, V2. So imagine you have this random string, right? It's an L-bit string, right? And so just think of the following. You release the string one at a time, the bit one at a time. So basically, Z0 come here, Z1 come here, Z2 come here. So then you basically, because it's communication, right? You can think about, when people receive a string, they become slightly one at a time if they show up. So he wants to do a little task that is, suddenly you pause at time I minus 1. Suppose he wants to build so-called the ith bit predictor. The picture is he will want to write an algorithm, or he wants you to write an algorithm, because in the complexity it's always flipped around to say no such thing as this. Right? He wants you to challenge you to write an algorithm that when you see this string, so this is literally the bit analysis now, right? You're looking into the sequence, that is ask you at this junction to predict the I. It asks you to go to predict the I. So this is a very local functional way to think about randomness, right? He basically said, you give me a random string, and you just release. Suppose I only care about whether the ith bit is robust or not. So I just ask you to release the first I minus 1 bit, then I set a freeze. So which means right now you only see this. I ask you to predict the ith bit. And then you clearly will decide to go this to 0, 1, right? You will go from 0 to 0, 1. You want to predict the next bit. And then he will score you to say, if this is equal to the I, then you're successful. So this is successful. If the I is not equal, which means you fail. So he did a little bit of one test at this bit level, right? So in some sense, this is the one test at the global scale, right? Saying that I give you random string draw from this distribution or draw from this distribution, then your job is to decide whether it's a uniform Y or pseudo-random Y, right? So here he basically said, let's just consider one sequence. Forget about you drawing from here and there. Let's just say, suppose in your mind you knew it could be either random or pseudo-random. So your job is to see a prefix of the bits then you want to build enough confidence to say, now I can predict the next bit. Right? so if you look at this test, if this happen to come from uniform string, what is the probability you can be correct? Can you do better than 50%? Right? Because whatever you predict is independent of that bit. Right? That bit is flipped after you predict it. Right? So clearly, against the uniform source, you can't write a predictor that can be successful more than 50%. Agree? Right? Because whatever you predict is independent of that bit that was flipped. How can you predict the bits that haven't been flipped? Unless later on in quantum world, right? But at this junction, you can't, right, in the classical world. Because that bit was not taught yet, right? So which means that against PUL, the probability that BI is successful. So this is PUL. You can't do better than half, right? Because that bit is unique. You can't even do worse than half. It's just half, because that bit was flipped afterwards. This is equality. You can't do better or worse than half. Doing worse is not bad. You have to understand in prediction business. If you consistently do predict wrong, what you should do? You should flip around, right? So that's why in this prediction business, it's a beautiful business, right? Either you get the information or you don't. Because if you're consistently wrong, it's good information. Because you just need to negate it. Okay? Then you will be more correct than not. Right? So this is basically almost like you're doing this weather report, right? Every day, evening, you have on the news, you will say whether tomorrow's day is raining or sunny. Right? And so if you live in some state where I used to live, Pittsburgh, near Chicago, and if you grade the weatherman or woman, their probability is not totally high, even though they have all the maps of the cloud, right? But in California, often when they predict sunny or not, they are very high, right? So which means our sunny and not sunny is clearly less random than, for example, in the area of Pittsburgh. Right? So this prediction literally means that living in Pittsburgh, you can't look at any other weather report. You can only look at all the sequence of days leading to here, then you want to predict that tomorrow. Right? Just like when you live in Los Angeles, you can look at all the days you predict for tomorrow. Right? So that's why here we can actually predict quite high, right? We just say, same as yesterday. That's actually often a very good predictor for us, same as yesterday. But clearly in some other dynamic weather environment, that is not, right? So this is called the next bit predictor. So Andy Yale's intuition is the following, that if a sequence is random, then intuitively you can't predict any bit correctly with better than half probability, right? Because that's true. Then he said, if a sequence is pseudo-random, right, it's pseudo-random, then intuitively you can't predict every bit, any bits, correctly with high probability either, with better than half either. So when he tried to flip this statement, he wanted to intuitively prove the following: if this is not pseudo-random, then he wants to say at least one of the bits is not good. If a sequence is not pseudo-random, but because in his intuition, if random, there's nothing you can do about any bits. You can't predict any bits. And if it's pseudo-random, he said intuitively, it's very hard for you to predict any bits. Then he said if a sequence is not pseudo-random, there must be one of the bits is weak. Right? Which one is weak? He said, I don't know, but one of them is weak. So basically he set up a mathematical proof of this statement. that if the source is not pseudo-random enough, then exists one of the bits that is weak. I think Boston just breaks through my phone. I began to receive the spam call routinely. I guess they recognize my Boston numbers. So this basically the task he wants to set out. Okay, and so let's state what that intuition in a theorem. But this is the theorem which we are going to prove. Given that, can we take a break and I will get some water? I'm running out now. Yeah. So then I will state the theorem. I prove the theorem, and hopefully slightly earlier, that give me a little bit of break for today. Yeah.